Hello, everyone. My name is Anne Marie Dortenzio, and today I will be talking about Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was girl bossing before it was cool, as she was one of the most visible leaders of the women's suffrage movement. In case you aren't familiar with this event, the women's suffrage movement was the fight to allow women to vote in the United States, lasting decades. Susan Brownell Anthony was no stranger to this fight, and practically earned her black belt in temperance, abolition, the rights of labor, and equal pay for equal work. The feminist icon was born on February 15th in the year 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. This Aquarius legend had parents that came from very different backgrounds. Her father, Daniel Anthony, was raised as a Quaker, while her mother, Lucy Anthony, came from a family that fought in the Revolutionary War. It is said that Susan was very inspired by her father's Quaker beliefs, stating that everyone was equal in God's eyes. This idea of equality sparked Susan's never-ending flame for justice in the United States. Susan also had 7 brothers and sisters, who all eventually became social justice activists for the emancipation of slaves. In other words, Lucy and Daniel were amazing parents who raised a lot of passionate and liberal kids. The family soon moved to rural New York, and Susan attended school there. She was an extremely intelligent student from a young age and eventually became a school teacher herself. Susan eventually left home to teach at a Quaker boarding school to financially assist her family during the Panic of 1837. She returned to her family 2 years later, and they had moved to Rochester, New York. There, Susan became acquainted with William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, who were friends of her father. Susan became especially close with Frederick Douglass, and their friendship led to her impassioned speeches against slavery she delivered all across the United States. However, all of her speeches against both slavery and for women's suffrage wouldn't have truly occurred without one of her closest confidants, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth was one of the organizers of the famous Seneca Falls Convention and was a women's suffrage activist herself. The two were so close that when Elizabeth's family moved to Seneca Falls in 1861, a room was set aside for Anthony in every single house they lived in. Elizabeth and Susan were extremely close, and Elizabeth even wrote about Susan in her diary entries. As one read, "I prefer a tyrant of my own sex, so I shall not deny the patent fact of my subjection, for I do believe that I have developed into much more of a woman under her jurisdiction." In fact, one of Stanton's biographers estimated that Elizabeth spent more time with Susan than any other adult in her entire lifetime, including her own husband. Yet history will say they were best friends. In terms of work, Elizabeth was an excellent writer and helped Susan craft her speeches with her own rhetoric, as she once wrote, "I forged the thunderbolts, and she fired them." The two of them traveled the country while Susan gave impassioned speeches defending women's God-given right to vote, as she would echo across many states. Anthony and Stanton also organized the Women's Loyal National League in 1863 to campaign for an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would abolish slavery. It was the first national women's political organization in the United States, collecting nearly 400,000 signatures to abolish slavery, quote, representing approximately 1 out of every 24 adults in the northern states, end quote. The petition drive significantly assisted the passage of the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. The goal of the League itself was to provide the women's movement with a vehicle for combining the fight against slavery with the fight for women's rights by reminding the public that petitioning was the only political tool available to women at a time when only men were allowed to vote. In addition, the pair co-founded the American Equal Rights Association, and in 1868 they became editors of The Revolution, a newspaper they used to help spread the ideas of equality for women. Later, when Congress passed the 14th and 15th Amendment allowing voting rights to African American men, Susan was bittersweet. While she was overjoyed that African American men were gaining rights, she was furious that women were not included in the legislation. As a result, Susan and Elizabeth formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, pushing for a constitutional amendment to give women the right to vote. In 1872, Anthony was arrested for voting. She was tried and fined $100 for her crime. Though this may seem like a horrible occurrence, the event actually made a great deal of people angry and put women's suffrage in the spotlight of the nation. In 1876, Susan B. Anthony protested at the 1876 centennial of our nation's independence. That was the location of her famous and prolific speech, the Declaration of Rights, written by Anthony, Cady Stanton, and another suffragist, Matilda Joslyn Gage. As Anthony said in her impassioned speech, "Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less." After this speech, Susan B. Anthony was regarded as a true activist for her efforts against slavery and her fire for women's suffrage. In 1888, Susan merged the two largest suffrage associations into one, called the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she led the group until the year 1900. She continued to travel around the United States, quote, giving speeches, gathering thousands of signatures on petitions, and lobbying Congress every year for women, end quote. Susan B. Anthony died in 1906, 14 years before women were given the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Besides the fact that Susan B. Anthony has two first names, I came to love her. She truly was a feminist icon that paved the way for many powerful women to come in the future. All of the information in this presentation was gathered from the textbook, the National Women's History Museum, and Wikipedia for dates and names, because I'm human. If you have any more questions about Susan B. Anthony, don't ask me because I told you everything I know about her. Have a great day!